Let's talk about how grains cause heart disease. That seems contrary to common advice, doesn't it? Because we're told for heart health to reduce total fat, saturated fat, and make your diet rich in healthy whole grains, right? Well, the shocking thing is these data that show that grains cause heart disease go back over 30 years. It's not new, and it's not my speculation either. There are people like Dr. Ron Krauss at University of California, Berkeley. There's a Johns Hopkins group. There's a University of Toronto group, a University of Texas group that have shown repeatedly over the last few decades that it's small LDL, small low-density lipoprotein particles that are the driving factor in heart disease. There are other factors also like insulin resistance, vitamin D deficiency, lack of omega-3 fatty acids, inflammation. There are other factors at play here. But from the perspective of diet and lipoproteins, the driving factor here is small, low-density lipoprotein, LDL particles. Now, so if you really want to understand heart disease, you have to look at the lipoproteins, the fat-carrying proteins in the bloodstream. That is, particles that convey cholesterol, triglycerides, and other factors back and forth from the liver to arteries and other organs. Not LDL cholesterol. That's the thing that everybody focuses on. That's the remnant of 1950s, 1960s guesstimation, where they couldn't measure lipoproteins 50, 60 years ago, so they resorted to measuring the cholesterol to guesstimate the number of those lipoprotein particles. It's extremely crude, should have been discarded decades ago, but it continues mostly because it makes a lot of money for the pharmaceutical industry in the form of statin cholesterol drugs and now other drugs. And of course, most doctors do not read the science. They read advertisements and listen to the salespeople who tell them things like the statin drugs are wonderful, reduce cardiovascular risk. They do not, by the way. That's a wild exaggeration. There might be a small, very small benefit on the order of about 1% reduction in cardiovascular events with statin drugs. I haven't used statin drugs for years, even though I used to prescribe them many years ago, like 20 years ago. So it's a small LDL particle. And why am I fingering grains? Well, because all grains, whether it's wheat, millet, corn, oatmeal, rice, triticale, all forms of wheat and other grains. By the way, when I say wheat, I really mean all grains because you don't think of grains this way, but they're grasses, right? They're seeds of grasses, and grasses are very promiscuous. They readily share the genetics. So, for instance, the genetic code of rye, a grain, is about 99% or more identical to that in wheat. So they're very promiscuous. They share genetics. So there's a lot of overlap. And one of the common features of grains is the carbohydrate unique to grains called amylopectin A. It's a long chain of sugars. Well, the other thing about amylopectin A is while there are many things in grains that are indigestible, like wheat germ agglutinin, which is a protein that's indigestible. It passes through the GI tract completely intact. It doesn't get broken down at all by your digestive enzymes. But the amylopectin A carbohydrate, or sugar polymer, is highly digestible. Digestion starts in the mouth because we have the enzyme amylase in the mouth and in the stomach. And amylopectin A is highly susceptible to digestion from that amylase. That's why if you chew a piece of bread, whole grain, white, doesn't make a difference. Chew a piece of bread, chew it, don't swallow, and you did a finger stick blood glucose before and a few minutes after chewing, you'll see your blood glucose go sky high without swallowing because there's amylase that begins the process. And that's why, by the way, the introduction of grains in the human diet about 10,000 years ago was accompanied by an explosion in tooth decay because of this feature of grains. Before the advent of consuming grains, tooth decay was rare. 1 to 3% of all teeth recovered prior to agriculture, prior to the consumption of wheat and grains. 1 to 3% of teeth showed decay, abscess formation, tooth loss, misalignment. With the adoption of agriculture and cultivation of grains, first wild, then cultivated, exposure to the amylopectin A, there was an explosion in tooth decay. 16 to 49% of all teeth showed decay, cavities, abscess, tooth loss, misalignment. We, of course, in the modern age have to compensate for having bad teeth by all kinds of dental hygiene efforts, right? fluoridated toothpaste, dental floss, cleanings, dentists, orthodontists, all the things we do to compensate for the tooth decay promoting effects of consuming grains as well as sugars. Grains and sugars are essentially, for this idea, are virtually interchangeable. But it's that amylopectin A that causes a big spike in the formation of small LDL particles. Now, the path to get there is a little bit complicated, so bear with me for a moment. You consume the amylopectin A of grains, it gets digested and goes to your liver, and the liver converts those sugars into triglycerides. And that process is called hepatic or liver de novo lipogenesis, creating fats out of something else, new fats, lipogenesis. Well, those triglycerides can't be released directly into the bloodstream because triglycerides are fats, and fats cannot float freely in the bloodstream because if they did, they would coalesce. Just like salad dressing, the oil coalesces in the layer, right? Same thing would happen in your bloodstream, and you would have it would cause damage to your organs. So the triglycerides are packaged into a particle called very low density lipoprotein, VLDL, a triglyceride-rich particle. So carbohydrates are the input, like amylopectin A from grains. Liver packages them into VLDL particles, triglyceride-rich. Those VLDL particles are themselves a cause for heart disease, coronary disease, because they can enter the arteries and cause heart disease. But they also, even more importantly, interact with LDL particles, not LDL cholesterol, not that marker, the indirect crude marker, but the actual low-density lipoproteins. And those triglyceride-rich VLDL particles transfer triglycerides to that LDL particle. There's a series of enzymatic reactions in the bloodstream that we say remodel the LDL particle, making it small. Well, that small LDL particle is very different. It's not recognized by the liver because there's a recognition protein on the surface of that LDL particle called apoprotein B. And the liver does not recognize that because it's small and it's concealed. The apoprotein B recognition protein is concealed, partially concealed, and the liver can't see it, can't recognize it. And so while large LDL particles with an exposed apoprotein B are cleared by the liver within 24 hours, quite readily, small LDL particles with that concealed apoprotein B will circulate in your system over and over and over because it's not being cleared by the liver, and it persists for about 5 to 7 days. So if you have a bagel on Monday or a bowl of cereal on Monday, you still have small LDL particles by the end of the week. So it's a very persistent and bad thing to have. Even worse, small LDL particles are very prone to oxidation and glycation, that is glucose modification, and that glycated and oxidized LDL particle is much more harmful, much more likely to enter the wall of arteries and then adhere, is very adherent also to structural tissues in your artery wall, and incite inflammation. The small LDL particle is much worse than a large LDL particle. And large LDL caused by fat consumption, small LDL caused by carbohydrate consumption. Grains, like amylopectin A of grains, and sugars. So that small LDL is perfectly crafted to cause heart disease. So we're told to cut our fat, right, thereby reduce expression of large LDL, and eat more healthy whole grains, and perhaps even everything in moderation, as they often say, right? Meaning soft drinks and ice cream and those kinds of sugary foods. Well, that lifestyle caused a flagrant uptick in small LDL. And here I'll show you. The test I prefer to do is called NMR, lipoprotein analysis, nuclear magnetic resonance. And all that means is your plasma, the clear part of your blood with the red blood cells taken out, is put into a magnetic field in an MRI device, also called an NMR device, nuclear magnetic resonance. And there's a signature for small LDL, and you'll see in these reports that there's a huge uptick in small LDL with consumption of the amylopectin A of grains and of sugars, not of fat. And so it's very graphic. And what happens when you go wheat and grain free and also sugar free as best you can, you'll see small LDL particles plummet. They won't go down 10% or 20%. They go down virtually 100% most of the time. It varies from individual to individual, but most of the time you'll see a really high count, let's say 2,400 nanomoles per liter, particle count per volume, drop from that high number, 2,400, to 0. That's very common, just with the elimination of wheat, grains, and sugars. Now, you can amplify the effect by taking steps to improve insulin resistance and inflammation. We do such things as restore vitamin D, magnesium, and omega-3 fatty acids, and we address colonic dysbiosis, or SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, because that drives what's called endotoxemia, the delivery of bacterial breakdown products into the bloodstream. That's a major driver of heart disease, insulin resistance, and inflammation. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, see my other YouTube videos, my podcast, my Define Health podcast, my books, my many books, starting with the Wheat Belly series, Undoctored, Super Gut, where I discuss how and why with the scientific rationale and the science that backs all this up. Bottom line, if you're told to cut your fat, saturated fat, eat more healthy whole grains, you've been given a recipe for certain provocation of heart disease, coronary atherosclerosis. So recognize that the real solution is the exact opposite. Getting rid of all wheat, grains, and sugars, never, by the way, limiting fat. Eating real foods, not processed, ultra-processed foods, restoring that basic list of nutrients, vitamin D, omega-3 fatty acids, iodine, and magnesium, and then address your gastrointestinal microbiome, and you now have the formula for preventing heart disease, or even preventing progression of heart disease. So one of the things I've done over the years is, going back over 3 decades, is we do CT heart scans to quantify coronary calcium, because calcium occupies about 20% of total atherosclerotic plaque volume. So if you've got 2 cubic millimeters of calcium, you've got 10 cubic millimeters of total atherosclerotic plaque volume. People say, oh, we don't care about hard plaque, we only want soft plaque. No, no, no. Calcium is an index of total plaque in all its elements. So we watch that score. If you do nothing, that score will increase. So a normal score is 0, typical score would be 400, say, which is a high score, especially in females. 400 at the start. If you did nothing, which is not smart, right? The score will be about 500, 25% higher in a year. A year later, 625, another 25%. So we help publish these data. If you do nothing, the score increases. Coronary atherosclerotic plaque grows at 25% per year. What if you take Lipitor, 40 milligrams, baby aspirin, exercise, cut your total fat, saturated fat, all those things, right? How fast will that score increase? How fast will coronary atherosclerotic plaque grow? 25% per year. Has no impact whatsoever. It's ridiculous. It's still called, shockingly, by my colleagues, optimal medical therapy. So that's like a joke, right? So what I'm telling you is the real way to gain control over cardiovascular risk and not have heart attacks, need for stents or bypass surgery, sudden cardiac death. I'm serious business, right? So it's elimination of the factors in diet that cause expression of small LDL particles, address the nutrient factors that impact insulin resistance and inflammation, address your microbiome. And that's the solution.